I'm an international speaker, speak at conferences, meetups. I write online tech content. I do live coding, streaming. I'm a FOSS maintainer, free and open source software, part of the NG work.
Yeah, I love the Octocat behind you. You just won GitHub Star, didn't you?
Yeah. It's right here.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's right. Oh, that's awesome. I
And
didn't even notice that.
up in the, you can't see it in the image right now, but up there's also the GitHub Stars Award. Yeah, I'm super proud of that because that's like you get nominated by community members. Like anyone can nominate anyone, and I think there was like 16,000 people nominated, and they picked 60 of us. So that's like I'm super proud.
Right. Oh, that's so cool. And speaking of nominations, you also got the MVP from Microsoft, right? That's another thing where you have to get nominated from a fellow MVP, right?
Yeah, that's a more like a product program similar to Google GDE. It's a Microsoft MVP program. So you have to be nominated by a Microsoft employee or a Microsoft MVP. So I'm also super proud of that, but just being like community nominations, that's even more impressive in my mind.
Oh yeah, I totally feel that. Well, it's one of those things where like I remember when I got into open source programming, like those were in fact they still are, right? Like one day I really want to like try to get like a star or like a GDE or like, you know, something like that, right? Like that's so cool to me. Like I really admire people that are able to kind of like rise above what their station is and like really accomplish that like community effort and get that respect from the community. Because you know, like it's not for nothing, right? You provide huge value. You maintain and create a ton of different open source projects. I'm certain you contribute to just as many, right? So it's always really cool to see the ecosystem rally behind like some cool creators.
So. Yeah, and then the GitHub Stars program is about every public community contribution, not only about open source, but that's one of the areas you can excel in and be nominated, but it's also about public speaking and organizing communities and writing and publishing books and videos and all those kind of things.
Well, and on that note, I mean, you've got This Is Learning, right? And I want to say, did that come before or after This Is Angular?
At the same time.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I wanted to branch off and create my own thing. I was with indep.dev before, very happy for a few years. And then I wanted to do my own thing that was more like even more open. Anyone can join, no matter your skill level. If you're just getting into public tech contributions or writing specifically, maybe, or then you're welcome to join. Just get in touch with me or Santosh Yadav. But yeah, I tried to come up with a name and found a name that could be used like both for a specific topic because I had a lot of Angular content and so does a lot of the offers. But at this point, This Is Learning, the publication is getting even more traction than This Is Angular. So I'm super happy with that. The primary organization is This Is Learning. We're doing other things than blogs at this point. And This Is Angular is just a branch of that because we have a lot of Angular specific content.
Well, and you also do like fireside chats pretty similar to this, right? Like if I'm remembering correctly, that may be Santosh Talks, which may be different.
Yeah, Santosh joined This Is Learning. It's something we do in our spare time. There's almost no money involved intentionally. We're doing everything without much cost so that we can stay free from any conflict of interest and just support, create platforms that people can join and publish their content or learn something and contribute. And we're doing open learning courses. So free courses for everyone. There's one on RxJS. We're working on one for NGRX. And we're working on some Angular guides as well. And maybe there will be other things eventually. But yeah, we're also doing videos. And Santosh has been doing a lot of those. But we actually have two more hosts joining this year. Um, um, I'm sorry, I'm sick today, so the memory is not very good.
You are okay. And again, I let me
J.
know if you
Cooper
need.
Bell and Ajit Singh. Yeah, there
Right.
they were.
And let me know if you need to like take a step back, or if we need to cut this short or anything like that. Happy to work that out. So
Hmm.
uh also viable, no. Like let's not tease people on
Guy on the
stream.
left, like he is not.
He's asking me whether I like Flint plugins. He's someone that's been part of some streams before, so he's being a bit of a dork.
Uh,
Um
well, yeah. Just to wrap up about like things about me. Well, I wrote a book that we're going to be discussing today, published a month ago or so. Wow.
there is green here. The reason why
Yeah,
it's red is
oh, it's
because
the
of green
green.
screen.
Yeah,
Yeah,
here it is
but
with green,
there
the
you
green
go.
version.
So yeah,
Nice.
and I've been reading through it, and it's really good. In particular, I've been loving reading like the APIs for like getting the current component instance in Ivy. Because we had mentioned this a little bit beforehand, but when I had to do like the Angular Ivy development, I remember like I was like, why isn't this like thing running when I expect it to? So I like went and add like console log statements all throughout like the compiler, and it drove me wild. Like I was so frustrated. And here you are with like, oh nope, it's just one line of code, and then you can tinker with all of it. And I'm like, why didn't I know this?
Yeah, you're speaking about the debugging API. Previously in View Engine, we had the ngprobe API, which could
Right.
do some of the same things, but new things have been added, and there's 10 functions now or something like that. And I go into just enough details about each one in this book. There's a whole chapter about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's one of my latest accomplishments, and I'm an international speaker. Speak at conferences, meetups. I write online tech content. I do live coding, streaming. I'm a FOSS maintainer, free and open source software. Part of the NG Worker group. Organizer of This is Learning, which we discussed, and This is Angular. I organized the Aarhus.js meetup, a JavaScript meetup in Denmark. Microsoft MVP and GitHub Star, and that's just what I do after hours.
Right.
Like my daytime job is as a front end architect, but yeah, I do development, hands-on development mostly. So I work on systems for the Danish energy industry, part of a company called Systemate in Denmark, and we specialize in sustainability and energy systems. So I'm very happy working in that domain.
Right.
And also the professional values of the company were all about DevOps and continuous delivery and continuous deployment and things like that.
Yeah, those are like so key. Like people forget that they're like kind of commonplace because once you get used to them, it's set and forget. Well, theoretically set and forget. The DevOps people make it very hard to make it appear that way, right? But when you don't have that continuous delivery and continuous integration, it's like such a headache. It's like, oh man, we have to manually deploy, and then once we do that, then we have to roll back the chain. It's like, yeah. So I totally
no, you roll forward.
Right.
Don't roll back. Yeah. I work on a lot of tooling, developer tooling, and workflows on GitHub and things like that.
Yeah. So I guess we can start there. So you have a GitHub organization called NG Workers, right?
Right.
Or is it just NG Worker? I could be wrong on that.
I think it's just NG Worker is the namespace on the GitHub organization and NPM. That's how it started out with the first package, and it was just one person, Nacho Vasquez. But now we're 4 people actively working and collaborating. So collectively we're called the NG Workers, plural, but the package is just NG Worker, singular.
Gotcha. So I know that y'all are like super organized. Like occasionally I'll see you guys like organize like meetups within yourselves to talk about like package updates and changes. Like, so first of all, like what packages do you maintain? Or what have you created? And then actually we have a question of what is NG? Is it not gonna? No, NG is Angular. It's kind of shorthand for Angular, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's always been NG it started in Angular.js, but it's only Angular today.
Right. So like what packages have you worked on? Like what projects are there?
Well, there's some in the works, but we have 4 packages out that you can use today. We started with a logging library for Angular, a plugin-based one called Lumberjack that comes with a few very common log drivers, so you can log through HTTP to a backend, and one for outputting to the console. But the point is, you use one API for logging. There's even a declarative API and an imperative API for configuring your log messages and levels and things like that. And then you can, without changing any of your application code, you can plug in, deactivate, and activate and filter your log providers and log levels. And you can, if there's not a plugin for the log provider you're using, you can create one yourself and plug it in. So it's an ecosystem based around being able to plug in things, and the architecture is driven by that. So that was the first package. That's when I joined the team, was after version 1, and we worked very intensively for 4 or 5 months on something like that on version 2. And one of the key points was that since we're plugin based, we wanted to support as many versions of Angular as possible. So right now we're supporting, 15 major and minor versions of Angular with one major version of Lumberjack. So that's kind of the next package we created was a GitHub action called Angular Versions Action for example, for library maintainers to easily run their code in the context of a different version of Angular. So it will switch out the dependencies for you. You can set up what's called a workflow matrix, where you say, I want to run this with Node.js 16 and Angular 13, and I also wanted to run it with Node.js 14 and Angular 12.2, things like that. So we have a very elaborate CI setup for the Lumberjack package that is using this Angular Versions Action.
That's awesome.
And so one of the things we want to add to that is support for NX CLI, because right now we're only supporting Angular CLI. But yeah, we are very open to help for that, by the way. So if you want to contribute to that, we will be very happy.
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, the GitHub Action stuff is super cool. I've been building some open source libraries within the past month or two. And Actions has been hugely instrumental in making sure that those are like properly maintainable, because otherwise it's like, hey, I got a pull request, time to manually test every single thing, and it's a huge headache. So
yeah,
definitely.
Yeah. There's many awesome things you can do. Like I'm a big fan now. I use it in my day-to-day job, GitHub Actions and workflows, and also in my spare time I experiment and for this open source work as well. So I've been doing a lot of that these past 2 years. 2 other packages we have are Spectacular, which is an integration testing framework or library, for Angular. And also the newest one is the Router Component Store, which is observables for the Angular router implemented using the NGRX component store, which means you can basically use it you can use it without any NGRX, basically. It wraps the component store, but you subscribe to observables, and you don't even notice what's used behind the scenes. You don't have to import the big NGRX store or effects or anything like that.
And I think that's super awesome. One of the difficulties that I've seen in really big Angular projects is that they'll go add NGRX, right? Because that's like the standard way of like managing things, right?
Yeah.
And then the difficulty there is that then it's like, okay, put all of your state in the global store, all of it, and then you go change pages 3 times, and all of a sudden your memory is up to like 100 megs or something ridiculous, right? And it's like, whoa, hold on, we did not need any of that in memory, right? So I think that router component store really helps to solve that problem, right? You're able to kind of rely on that a little bit more, and get information about your router, and tie it into your component store and kind of keep your information more consolidated there, right?
So this package uses the Nginx component store as a peer dependency. So you would have to install that yourself, but you don't have to configure anything. It will just work. You'll just inject this service, or there's even two services. There's a local one and a global router store right now, at least. And we're still in early versions, 0 point something. But yeah, it should do most of the things you'll need. I'm using it in production today, and we'll go from there. But yeah, it's really nice that you don't have to, you can use it without having to worry about any Nginx package yourself, basically, except for adding this to your dependencies. And that's it. You don't have to register anything.
So one of the packages that you mentioned was Spectacular, right?
Yes.
Oh, am I? No, I think that should be
It's right. You're wrong.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I've been really interested in following Spectacular, right? Because it's a lot of like application harness. Like, I guess, can you help explain a bit of like what a testing harness is, like within the context of Angular, and like what are the downsides, what are the upsides, and where does Spectacular fit into all that? I think that's been something that I've been really interested in as I've been following your projects.
Yeah. So component testing harnesses is an API created by the Angular CDK package, and so that you can add kind of test as a user APIs to your components. And Angular Material added component harnesses for testing in the Angular Ivy versions. But you can also write one for your own library, for your own application. But that's not really related to the testing harnesses exposed in Spectacular. That's a different concept.
Gotcha. What is the differences?
In Spectacular, there's one function and you pass it some parameters and you get back an object, and that's it's just a type that's called like Spectacular feature harness or pipe harness and things like that. So it's really just a type that has some properties that you can use for testing whatever it is you want to test. So it's unrelated to the component harnesses.
Gotcha. I apologize. I admittedly was not quite as familiar with Spectacular.
Yeah, but yeah, Spectacular is all about trying to test Angular specific things as close to the real thing as possible. So without faking things and testing, for example, testing a pipe through a template, not through an isolated class or anything like that. Also enables testing bootstrap listeners and application initializers, which is difficult or even impossible with just a test bed. And you would configure it similar to how you would do it in your app. So those are the two of the APIs, and the third one is probably the most important one, in my opinion, is the feature testing API. That allows you to set up, scope the test for an entire Angular module, so a routed feature module, so that you can say, this is what the part of my application I want to test, with everything inside of it, like components, services, pipes, anything like that. And you're not setting up any fake things, except you're just saying, I want to test this module. So you're testing everything inside of there without faking it, without replacing anything with test doubles. So basically, it allows you to test an entire feature in isolation. You don't even need an actual app, which is very interesting. That would enable testing things like micro front ends without having a host application. Really cool. And the proof of concept for that is in the repo for Spectacular, where I'm testing a feature from the Two of Heroes tutorial, the Crisis Center tutorial from the router tutorial, without any applications at all.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah.
And I think you had mentioned something about modules, right? Being able to test modules, and testing Angular specific functionality. Yes. I would think that it would make things easier to test for like Angular libraries, right? So something like testing out a router component store without having to build a full scale application and then adding in a manual test harness and stuff. So yeah, that's super interesting.
And another part is it's built to be integrated with other testing libraries, because if you want to test as a user, you're interacting with the DOM, and you're not worried about things like components and services and touching those or mentioning those in your test, at least as little as possible. Because they are, at the end of the day, they're implementation details. The user doesn't care about how many components or which components you have. But I didn't want to create an entire user interaction API, like inspecting the DOM, interacting with the DOM, things like that. So I wanted to defer back to using another library for that, which is great at that. So one of the things you can integrate with is component harnesses, actually. And the other one is the Angular testing library. It's part of the testing library family of libraries, which the most popular one is for React, but there's one for many other frameworks like Cypress and native vanilla JavaScript and other things.
It's actually funny you mention it. I'm building one for the CLI that I'm like really crossing my fingers. I'm trying to make official.
Cool. That's great. Yeah, I really like that.
Yeah, it's a weird idea. So I maintain an open source project, and basically I wanted a way to properly test the end-to-end results, right, without having to like mock out or stub out, like how do you console out or std out or whatnot, right? So yeah, that's the idea behind the CLI testing library.
Oh, but are you looking to make it part of the testing library namespace on?
Yeah, we'll see if it gets there. But because there's a lot of like, hey, there's no DOM. How do you do anything, right? So we'll see if it goes anywhere. But yeah, here I'll link it up.
There's one like that. There's the hooks testing library for React, which is kind of special and kind of unrelated to the other ones. So yeah, why not? Why not?
Yeah, and I mean, for what it's worth, I'm trying to keep the API as close as possible. So we'll see.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, about the testing library. So that's a super library, but it's also still focused on testing one component and maybe some child components. So I've been experimenting and researching on how can you test a whole feature or whole domain of an Angular application, because it's more natural and it's even possible with React testing library to say I want to test the entire app, because the app is one component and all components follow that. So you can easily render the entire app or just part of the application with the React testing library. But with the Angular testing library, you're saying I want to test this component, and you can also add some modules as well. But what about the routes? What about the app component? Things like that. That's not really easy to do either in the test bed or in the Angular testing library.
It's not, yeah.
So yeah, I've been looking into a lot the router testing module. I wrote like 3 articles about it, testing routed components, routing components, and route guards using the test bed and the router testing module. And that led me to the point of creating Spectacular, actually. And then I've been doing some work to write some documentation. It's in a pre-release, but it's perfectly usable right now. Also, it's a testing package, so don't worry about it being a pre-release.
Right.
But yeah, it's being used, and the reason it's not version 1.0 yet is I want to be able to use Angular versions action to ensure cross-version compatibility with different versions of Angular. But we don't have NX support, and it's in our NX mono repo.
Yeah.
But I've been using it with Angular 10, 11, 12, 13, so
that's awesome.
It's working fine. And currently using it for the app I'm working on at work, and it ties very nicely into our testing strategy, which is more focused on integration testing. So it's the same thing. We're not replacing, we're replacing as little as possible. And Spectacular allows us to set up an entire part of the application, and you share that test setup and having a very simple test setup where you just mention the module, the routed feature module, and the route path, lazy loading that feature. And that's it. And then you use the Angular testing library to interact with the DOM, click buttons, fill out text in fields, and submit and things like that. And then we even use a proper backend, so we're not even stubbing
wow.
out the backend in our tests.
So
So
like
we're
like a middle ground between like usual integration testing, which like
yeah,
integrates from the uh, HTML all the way down, but now you're adding the layer of backend and also like this, but it's not
yeah.
quite a full end-to-end test where you have to
Mhm.
spin up the browser and have to do all this other stuff. That's really, really cool.
Yeah,
That's super
that's one
powerful.
of the nice points is it's you can do the same things as with an end-to-end test
Hmm.
almost, or you can if you put in some extra effort, but you can do
Hmm.
it at the feature level.
Right.
There's still some things where like going into Cypress and using the Cypress testing library, for
Hmm.
example, for language selection and login flows. Those are examples
Right.
of where like end-to-end tests are really great. But we can actually do the same here, but with the flexibility of the test bed, so we can replace certain services in Angular if we want to and if it makes sense. And it's like 10 times faster than Cypress tests.
Nice.
So it's kind of taking the best from both worlds, like the not having to create all these stubs and marks if you don't want to, but you can where it makes most sense. And also having the speed of the test bed because it's been getting faster and faster with
Hmm.
the Ivy versions of Angular. So and Cypress, like it's great tool, but it takes a long time to spin up an application. And like we're talking seconds or tens of seconds with Cypress, whereas here we're talking uh, tens of milliseconds
Wow.
per integration test.
So you mentioned that some of that speed benefit is with Ivy, and even your book title like literally has Ivy right there, right? Like it's
Yeah,
nice and bold, like it's right there. For those that maybe not be familiar with too much of Angular's history, like
yeah.
what is Ivy? And you even touched on it a little bit earlier. Like what is View
Sure. What is Ivy? That's a very good question, and
Engine? I mean, I guess you wrote a book about it, right? Like
yeah, I wrote the book on Ivy. Yeah, no, I okay. So a bit of backstory about the book, maybe, and then we can get to into what is
yeah,
Ivy.
yeah.
So Pack Publishing is the publisher. They own the rights for the book, and I get paid royalties. I wrote it together with another Dane called Jacob Andresen, and Pact got in touch with me and asked me, "Do we want to write a book about Angular Ivy?" I've been writing a lot of content about Ivy, so I don't know. Maybe someone suggested my name or whatever.
Hmm.
And first, I said no because I didn't think it was very interesting for me personally to write another introduction because there's not that much different in the Ivy versions from the View Engine version. So if you wanted to contain like all of like what's a component, what's a service, the same concepts are there for the most part. Not much has changed in that regard. So a very tiny bit would be about Ivy specific things, and most of it would be what is Angular and how do you structure an Angular app and all of that. And that hasn't changed much in recent
Hmm.
versions of Angular. So I instead suggested that how about doing a book that starts where many other books and other content stops. Like it stops when what is components, what is dependency injection, all of that. No, we're starting from that point and saying, you know what components are, you know what the Angular CLI is, you know about dependency injection, and you know how to write an app, but you want to know what's new that I can use in the Ivy version. So that's from versions 9 to 12 are covered
Right.
in the book, and now we have version 13 recently, but 9 to 12 are covered in the book. So I spent years looking into what's new and what has changed. I I I, I scoured through the change logs of all the packages from Angular to find the most broadly usable and biggest changes and additions in Ivy. So the recent versions of Angular, and collected all that into a book and learned a lot about it myself during that writing.
Oh yeah, I'd
So
imagine.
so so this book, um, accelerating Angular development with Ivy, it's for the experienced Angular developer, meaning you don't have to be an absolute expert, but at least you have all the basics down, you have all the fundamentals down. You want to know how can I improve my developer experience through the tooling that comes with Angular, especially the newer tooling with Ivy. How can I take make good use of the new APIs. How can it optimize my applications, my tests, things like that. So you're really looking into what's the new things that have happened over the past 2 years of Angular releases. So both people that are relatively new to Angular will learn a lot, but also people like myself who have worked with 4 years or so with Angular and AngularJS and other frameworks before that and after that can learn from this. Like anyone will learn something from this book, and it's 200 pages, 12 chapters, just jam packed with new stuff, and many of the chapters, like you can invest just a little time in reading it and learn a lot. So if you're not a big reader and spending hours and hours reading, you can just take it down from the shelf, read a chapter or even a section, learn something you didn't know, and put it back on your shelf and get back to it later. And some of the chapters are more for reference, so picking it up when you need it. And there's 4 chapters in the middle that are more like hands-on, if you want to go like tutorial style and add features to an existing application. So there's like different styles of learning depending on how you like to approach learning and what you want to learn.
Yeah. And honestly, I was really impressed by how in-depth it goes, right? Like there were a few instances where it talks about like dependency injections, right? And I think tokens with dependency injections are super kind of misunderstood in Angular in general, right? Like there's so much capability there. You can provide up, you can provide down, you can, turn yourself upside down, right? Like the dependency injection system in Angular is super, super powerful. And there were a few sections in here I was like, oh, okay, that's how you do that, right? And I think that says a lot because I've dealt a fair bit with the dependency injection system, so it was really cool to be able to see that that level of advancedness, but also like being able to like get to that point, right? Like you kind of build up to it a little bit. So like if you are relatively new, you've built a few components or whatnot, you're not just like thrown into the fire and it's like, here, have fun, So it definitely was a good read overall. So,
well, thank you.
Yeah.
So back to the question, what is Ivy? Well, what did Ivy turn out to be? At the end, it was a new compiler for Angular, a new ahead of time compiler, also a new Jit compiler, but most of the improvements are in the AOT compiler. There's something you don't need to know about as a developer, but yeah, it's a lot of the internals have been rewritten, both the runtime APIs, the core rendering engine, the compiler, of course, the tooling. You don't have to know about it, but there's a few sections, even a whole chapter about AOT compilation and Angular and Ivy and how that has improved for all phases of development. There's mention of there's a whole chapter about the Angular compatibility compiler, which is also necessary because of changes with Ivy. And the main change there behind the scenes is this Ivy instruction set. It's an incremental DOM style application. Google created a library a few years ago called incremental DOM, and this is using the same pattern, and it's different from the view engine, which compiled your components and whatnot into data structures that were then more like interpreted at the runtime. So it was more like, I don't know, some intermediate language or bytecode or something like that. Whereas the Ivy instruction set is more like change something on this DOM element. And they are more reusable because they're more like they're primitives of doing specific things with a DOM element. Right. And making them reusable as opposed to a bunch of very different looking data structures where you cannot really statically analyze what's needed and what's not needed before running the application. That's part of the internal beauty of Ivy is now you can tree shake away the parts of the core framework that you're not using. Like if you're not using animations in your application, the animations instructions, Ivy instructions, will not be part of your app bundle. And the same with internationalization, things like that. That's good examples of what can be left out of your application if you're not using it. But it's all the way down to dependency injection and
oh wow.
Yeah, like certain ways of interacting with the DOM element.
So, and for context for any viewers out there, the reason why I'm so surprised about it being able to tree shake the dependency injection is that it's pretty central to a lot of Angular functionality, right? Like that's a pretty core feature to be able to just tree shake based on that statistical analysis. Is really, really cool.
Well, think about if you're doing a library with just one component in it, you
Right.
might not even need dependency injection, or maybe you're creating Angular elements, so custom elements, web components, using Angular components. You might not need dependency injection.
Yeah,
So,
that's really cool.
so it's just as much as possible should be able to be taken away, which increases at least the framework part of the bundle, and the IV instructions that are generated are also overall they're smaller, but like it depends on things like the size of your application, what features you're using. All of that is discussed in the book, like how will it affect a small app, a medium-sized app, a big app, things like that.
Right. So, speaking about app sizes, right? Kind of looping back to dependency injection, I think that that's where it comes into play, right? Because you're right, for an application or for most smaller applications or for libraries or something, you're really not needing to provide huge swaths of data kind of back and forth, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we've seen the ecosystem. I want to say that I've seen more dependency injections start with Angular, right? Like that, like it kind of started with or not started, but was very heavily utilized in early versions of Angular or Angular 2, right? But then as the ecosystem of like the big three front end frameworks, like Vue now has like an inject provide, and React now has use context, which is like a form of dependency injection, right? Like, I guess my question is like, what do you think makes Angular's dependency injection special, and how do they differ if you're familiar with any of the other APIs? And if not, that's totally fine.
I haven't spent much time lately with React, and I haven't used Vue professionally, but I can tell you for sure that Angular's dependency injection system is a lot more powerful, also a lot more complicated. But and most or a lot of Angular developers are not even aware of all the features of the dependency injection system.
Right.
Like they will just create a service, inject it in your component, and use singletons most places. So even a concept or a technique like a component level provider, so it's a service that's instantiated and follows the life cycle of one component, or even one instance per component instance if you have multiple instances of the same component, versus sharing just one instance for the whole app. That's something that not even all Angular developers are aware of. And the things you mentioned in the book are two new provider scopes, what's known as provider scopes. I think in version 6 of Angular, we got the root level scope provider, where you can basically make an application-wide singleton on the service without any modules. So you don't have to import a module to inject a service. You can just mention that service in your, for example, your components constructor, and Angular will figure out how to instantiate it based on that one. What are they called? Decorator called injectable, and then you pass it the provided and root option. But now we have two new options. One is called platform, and one is called any. And they were added without much fanfare to the Angular 9, or was it 10? One of those first versions of Ivy. They are not documented a lot. I think Santosh wrote most of the documentation, and it focuses around how does it work internally, but not as much on. I was interested in exploring what are good use cases for this, and I think the platform level provider is the easiest one to understand, but it's meant for very specific use cases like Angular elements and micro frontends, where you want to share elements outside of the scope of an so-called application. Because if you create, for example, Angular elements, each element is an Angular application. So you might want to share services between those. You can do that with a platform level provider. And the same with micro frontend. They would also be several applications bootstrapped to the same DOM. at the same time. So you would also like to share services between them. That's the platform level provider. And maybe if we find the
Yeah, it's in there.
If you speak about something, I'll find the diagram here of the any provider, and we can look at like conceptually, visually what it looks like.
Yeah, that'll be really helpful, because I know that there's been a lot of like really nice like graphics in here to be able to help explain stuff, which is, I think, really nice for me, because like I tend to be a bit more like kinesthetic and a bit more visual, right, when I'm learning something. So like having the code samples, being able to type them out and experiment, and then be able to have that visual aspect as well is really nice, to your point.
Yeah. So there's a public GitHub repo. There's I think there's like 12 small, what I call feature apps that are related to a section and a chapter. And there's one real world style application for the 4 chapters in the middle, where you build off from that and add new features using some of the new capabilities with Ivy. So there's a lot of hands-on code, and you can look at the full solutions in the GitHub repo and experiment from there, fork it, and use the concepts and see them, having them in a working state. So you don't have to type it all out by hand. And yeah, there are a few visualizations. It's always difficult to do that, but there are a few. And the provider scopes is an example of where I thought that was very important to get a conceptual understanding and visual understanding. So here I'm looking at, let's see, this is the any provider scope. So this is more difficult to understand. So the chapter or the section on this is longer than the platform. You know what? Let me find a platform provider scope visualization first.
And I think, to your point, one of the things you were talking about with dependency injection, like how it can be beneficial in real world applications, is like a great example is translations, right? One of the applications that I was in needed a shared component system, and that shared component system needed to be translated in slightly different ways from language to language, or from application to application, right? So having that ability to inject at a component level or at a XYZ level was really beneficial for us to be able to go, okay, how are we going to provide these strings to the shared component system without having to release 18 different versions of that shared component system? So
so in the Lumberjack logging library, I learned even more about the Angular dependency injection system, because it's a library built on just services. So, and when you want to make your Angular modules configurable, there's some things that are not very easy to do. So you really have to get a good understanding about the dependency injection system and injection tokens and module with providers, static methods, things like that. So yeah, again, it's a very powerful system. There's many different patterns that you can learn to use for the Angular dependency injection system. So I found here, this is, I don't know if we can get it in focus here. This is the platform provider.
So like 2 applications.
Yeah, this is supposed to be 2 micro frontends, a music micro frontend and a document micro frontend. So think of an operating system or in the browser or whatever. So they share one injection token called the storage token, and this is supposed to be an abstraction on top of the local storage in the browser. They would want to share that because it is a shared API that's not unique to each application. So we could use a platform provider scope for that, and they could share that between them. Of course, to be able to inject it, they would have to have shared access to it. And Angular is not really built for micro frontends yet. It's something they're going to look more into. And now we have module federation, but things like this, like sharing, how to share a service between Angular elements or micro frontends. Well, you could put it in the global scope, and that might be the fallback case to do that. Or you can put it, like you can publish it in a library, because they need to have the exact same reference for it to be injectable in both of these micro frontends.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So that was the easy part to understand.
now,
And then,
now it's time for the any.
yeah, now it's the advanced case here. So this is the any provider scope. So if you know about dependency injection, you might know that, well, there's two kinds of injectors behind that. There's module injectors, and there's element injectors or node injectors that are more tied to the component tree, which DOM elements are active and managed by components. But these provider scopes are about module injectors. So the any provider scope can be used to create an instance per module injector, which means there will be one for the main chunk or the main bundle of your application. That's the root level injector. But there will also be an instance per lazy loaded chunk. So say a feature, an Angular feature, they will share an instance. Each lazy loaded chunk will create a new module injector, and each module injector will be able to create a new instance of that service. And let's see if we can get this in focus again for this diagram here. It's really difficult, man.
You're good. Hey, almost. There we go. Yeah.
Yeah. So here we're using the any provider scope for backend configuration. So for example, I think this example, we're setting options for a retry delay and count of retries to the API service, things like that. So that can be configurable per bundle. And we can have a fallback one to the root level provider if we're not setting a configuration for a specific chunk or a specific part of our application.
Right.
So this is a really advanced scenario.
Right.
But if you're not even aware of what it does, I mean, I didn't get enough information from the documentation to, well, conceptually, what does it do? Well, you can create multiple instances of the same service, but okay, what are good use cases?
Right. So and I think that's where most documentation tends to fumble, right? Is like, okay, but where do I use it? Right.
Yeah. And good use cases for the any provider scope is things like metrics, logging, any sort of configuration on the where you want to be able to customize configuration per for different features of your app. So logging and API configuration and metrics, and those are good use cases for that.
And here's another one that I think is like kind of an interesting, like it seems niche, but the more you think about it, I think makes a lot of sense. It's like, so we were talking earlier about like how dependency injection can, or like global stores with like NGRX or similar, right? The big problem is that like if you provide it at a root level and then have all of your page information try to load from the same place, you're going to end up with a lot of memory that you're not using, right? So what you can do is you can have a global store, a truly global store, and then you can potentially have like a feature instance store, right? That's provided at a module for the lazy loaded feature. So that when you're toggling between pages within that feature, no problem. It works just fine, right? And then as soon as you leave that feature scope, it destroys the store and frees up that memory that you're not utilizing anymore. So like, I think that's probably a little bit of like a different way of doing things. You would configure it probably a little differently. But there is definitely some interesting ideas that you can utilize the any provider for.
So the any provider wouldn't do that. It doesn't follow the life cycle of any component because it's tied to a module, and a module doesn't get destroyed in an application.
Oh, it doesn't. Okay.
So, so you would use NGRX component store for that, or create your own component level services. When you do that, they can't be tied to the life cycle of any specific component. So it might be the top level component for a page or feature of your app. And that's right. And that's what, for example, this router component store package allows you to do. You can scope it to a root instance, which means that it will be created the first time it's used, but it will never be destroyed again. But you can also scope it to a feature or just that one component using the router component store, and it will be unloaded as soon as that component is removed from the component tree.
Makes sense. Yeah, gotcha. And then like at the top level, you'd have like a router outlet that would then allow you to like kind of transparently pass the actual view down to whatever is actually rendering at that time.
Yes, the local router store in this package is tied only to the component. Well,
Mhm.
so it's using mostly the activated route service, which is provided per component that is
Right.
active. But some things like the URL, it's taken from the router service,
Mm.
whereas the global router store is using uh, the router service directly and subscribing to all the router events and picking out pieces from there and emitting them into these observables in the internal state.
Gotcha. So, well, hey, we have about 8 minutes left. And there's a question that I always love to ask Angular developers, especially ones that are like so ingrained in like the advanced usage stuff. What do you think is next for Angular? Because I've heard some whispers through some RFCs, but I think
Mm.
you're the one that's actually going to know a lot more about this. So I'm really curious to hear your thoughts.
I have no power of what happens to Angular.
Well, yeah, no power, but social power, like influence in terms of like I have some ideas, hear me out, right?
Well,
What do you think
of
is
course,
next?
there's a roadmap, so you could just look into that.
True.
There's RCs that are part of the roadmap. There are some that are part of the future part of the roadmap.
Right.
So what is definitely, or what is most probably going to happen? We're finally going to see standalone components,
Yeah.
and I'm all about that. Like right
Right.
now, I'm using this scam pattern, and that's like a precursor to standalone components, where
Right.
you get rid of modules for the sake of declaring components, directives, and pipes, and you
Mhm.
will be able to declare them in the component decorator or in the pipe decorator or the directive decorator, and all the so say you're building a component and it needs a child component and a pipe, you will mention those classes in your component decorator. So you don't have to have that indirection of having, so this component is declared in a module and it needs to import another module declaring that other child component. That's just really difficult to learn and reason about. And it's a module system on top of a module system. And it really, the dependency is in the template, like mentioning a custom element or pipe name or directive attribute. That's the dependency, but it has to be registered through these modules, which is kind of weird and unique to Angular.
Right. Right.
Whereas Vue has an API where you can mention the child components in an option on that same component. So
Mm-hmm.
that's the style we're going to see in Angular now, finally. So we can't get entirely rid of modules, and you can keep using modules, by the way, if you prefer. Um, but it's an important piece of making Angular modules more optional for some concerns, at least. So that's something we're going to see within this past year or two. And
Yeah.
another thing we're most definitely going to see is strongly typed Angular forms. It's being
Hey,
worked on right now in a branch.
nice. I didn't know about that one. That's really cool.
Yeah,
'Cause
and
I
there's an RFC for this. Well, if you want to stop at the 1 hour mark, we don't have much time left.
well, I
So
definitely want to hear about what this next one is because it sounds like it's a big one. Because I don't mind if we go a little bit over.
okay,
Um,
well, I don't mind either. I have tons of topics to discuss. But anyways, there's an RFC out for, well, a few that are related. There's one about, can we get rid of the Jit compiler? Because now AOT with Ivy is usable everywhere in the development server, in testing, in at runtime, um, at compile time. Yeah, everywhere it's usable, and we can do partial Ivy compilation, so we don't have to use Angular compatibility compiler
right.
anymore to transpile from Vue engine to Ivy. So can we get rid of the Jit compiler now? That's what the Angular team is asking. So they were asking about what's the use cases for the Jit compiler, and turned out most of the use cases was for testing. So dynamically creating components for tests for the purpose of test, but also dynamically creating components at runtime. Say you have a build once, deploy many times type of application where it's configurable based on a server
Hmm.
configuration, like something like a CMS. So you're creating the Angular components dynamically based on whatever user-generated content you have on the server side.
Right.
You would need something dynamic for that. You couldn't really make that very ahead of time compilable. So to support that, there's a suggestion or proposal for a new, more, I don't know what it's called, like something about dynamically rendering or composing components. So it will be more of a, well, there's a suggestion. The suggestion is not, it's not the nicest API. So we're hoping they can create a better API, but it's just as an initial idea. But basically, you will be able to create components based on calling some functions and creating some arrays and data structures, kind of similar to, say, the JSX, like React Elements, right? The JSX things behind the scenes, something similar to that. Creating that by calling functions and things like that. That would enable you to create them based on some server data or whatever. So if we get that, and we can use that for our testing libraries to dynamically create wrapping components and things like that, that might enable the Angular team to remove the Jit compiler altogether. So shrinking the code base,
hugely,
removing some shared APIs, so making the compiler smaller, maybe even making the runtime smaller as well.
Yeah, and I think that's the big one that I had heard about. And that's the one that I think I'm like kind of crossing my fingers for, like I don't have to sit there. At very least, I'd love to see us make AOT default, because I that may have been done recently, but I remember that's been like a huge frustration of like, hey, we have our fancy new project. It's set up super well. Is AOT on? What do you mean? Is it on? So.
Yeah, I started with Angular in version 4, and that was the first version with the AOT compiler, or maybe it was 5 that got the AOT compiler. It was one of those, 4 or 5. But anyways, there were a lot of things you couldn't do, so you had to, and you really needed to know some very complicated stuff to make it AOT compilable. And yeah, it was not easy, but most of those things have been kind of made easier now through tooling. For example, we got the strict mode. If you're using strict compilation for the TypeScript compiler and for the Angular template compiler, or template compiler was the generation before Vue Engine, so sorry about that name confusion there. But anyway, the Angular component strict template type checking. If you're using those, there's not a lot of things left that you cannot detect and get pretty good error messages about in Ivy anymore. There's only a few edge cases that you can't do in AOT, but there's a workarounds for them. Those are also mentioned in the book, like how do you get around these limitations of the AOT compiler?
Right, definitely a lot of exciting stuff coming in Angular's future, and they've definitely done a lot of work since the 4 and 5 days.
Sure,
so it's been exciting to see. So.
But these were like, what are the possible things we're going to see? I have some personal things I'm hoping for, and some things that there might come. So another definite thing is the Angular material will be rewritten to use the material components for the web MVC.
Yeah,
and that will add some accessibility capabilities to Angular material, and it will allow us to use CSS custom properties instead of SAS variables.
Right.
And now with IE11 support removed from Angular, now they can go do that. We've been waiting around for years for that to happen. So that's nice, but it's taken it's a year-long project to do this, and they're testing it out in the Google mono repo. So I think we're reasonably close we'll probably see it next year. The MDC enabled Angular material components. And that's one of the reasons they added these component test harnesses. So we have an option not to depend on implementation details like selectors and classes that are added at runtime. That we can use the component harnesses in our test instead of reaching into the internal DOM structure of Angular material.
Right, which was fun to say the least.
Yeah. So yeah, but okay. So if we're getting standalone components, it's still not optional ng modules all the way. It's not a module-free application. Um, that's something they might want to take on later on. It'll be several years before we might see that, but that would be very interesting. That's something I've been interested in for 3 years at this point. Like, how can you create an entire application without any modules at all? So I would love to see that. Other things, well, we're getting strongly typed forms, but what about reactive forms that are more reactive? Like, you can configure the status or the disabled state or the value based on some observable as input, or you can set up the validators based on observables, right? Instead of those APIs are imperative today. You can subscribe to them as observables, but you can't influence them using observables.
Right. And that's been a pretty big point of contention in a lot of like applications where you're trying to do like live previews, for example. And like do like back and forth between two things. So I definitely think that'd be really cool to see as well. Like leaning further into the reactivity of like RxJS and such would be really nice.
Definitely. Testing. So we saw recently, even in version 13, they switched on Angular testing module teardown by default, which means that the Angular root component in your test, the one you're calling create component on, it will be turned down between or after each test case. And root level providers will now be destroyed after each test case. Before, root level providers were never destroyed. So you might have multiple side effects, or it could, like the order of your tests might influence the result of the test before this was enabled. And also the speed of the test, especially if you're using Karma, because it was adding some style elements that were never removed. It was adding some DOM elements that might not be removed. It was pretty clear when you were using Karma, because the last tested component was still visible in the DOM. Now you're looking at a blank page when the tests are over.
Right.
So it's a speed upgrade, but it's, in my mind, it's more about consistency and making the test close to a real app. If you're all of a sudden getting some errors, well, you had some shared state between your tests before, or you had some stateful services without teardown mechanisms, or maybe you had teardown mechanisms, but they were never activated before by the testbed. So yeah, that's nice. But what about more additions to testing? Like, we need a new testing API for standalone components instead of testing modules. We still need a way to test platform providers and any provider scopes. Today, the platform providers are in the same state as root level providers were before, in that they're never destroyed. How can you destroy them in the test bed? And how can you set up that module injector tree of any provider scopes and also tear them down after a test case?
Right.
That's still missing.
Well, for what it's worth, I think that it's like, it is really impressive to be able to point to all these specific examples, right? Like, I think it definitely demonstrates like a level of expertise in the subject to be able to look forward and see what needs to be changed in the ecosystem, especially when dealing with like as in-depth of features as you're talking about, like the any providers. Because, given that they're not super publicly surfaceable, knowing what needs to be changed within them is already like, wow, okay, so we're really deep territory, right? Which is really awesome. And I know that a lot of platforms have a long way to go. And I would be excited to hear much more about all this. You are more than welcome to join us again for the future. And you know that I'm always like trying to watch all the conversations you have, because they're always super insightful. But we are running at time. We're a little bit over, and I've got to run on some stuff today. But a huge thank you for joining us. Deeply, deeply appreciated. And it's been super insightful. I've been learning a lot in this conversation. And with your book, do you want to give it a shout out?
Yeah, I totally forgot. I have a promo code, so you can get 25% off the digital copy, the link for the book. So if you buy a digital copy directly from Pack Publishing, you can get 25% off until the 15th of December.
Definitely take up on that, because this book is great. It provides all sorts of information. So go check it out. All right, y'all. Well, hey, Twitch, thanks so much for hanging out. I will see y'all next time. And Lars, again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
Right.